I told you so. The IMF, just about 2 weeks ago, changed their mind. They said that countries ought to use capital controls under certain circumstances. They realized that the free mobility of capital can be very destabilizing. The evidence in the midst of the crisis is overwhelming, and interestingly, in the case of Iceland, they actually endorsed the country to use the capital controls. Well, there's a broader issue in the area of financial market liberalization and opening up markets. Should India, for instance, open up its markets to derivatives and CDSs, those kinds of products that are very innovative? Well, the question that India ought to be asking is, what do these innovative products do? And do they actually lead the economy to perform better? They might make some people in the financial markets more money, but that's not the test of whether a financial product is a good product. It's whether it enhances growth. The financial sector is supposed to be a servant of the rest of the economy. It's supposed to make the rest of the economy more efficient, manage risk, grow faster. And interestingly, Paul Volcker, former chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, said, and you know, this is not somebody who is a radical, said he couldn't find a single innovation in the financial sector that had promoted economic growth or well-being other than the ATM. And what was wrong was that the ATM was a UK innovation, not an American innovation. So the question that India has to ask as they discuss opening themselves markets up to these kinds of financial products, or either from abroad or domestically, is what is it going to do for promoting growth in India? And if a compelling case can't be made that it will promote growth, the evidence is so overwhelming that these instruments will promote instability that one should be very careful. I began my talk by reference to the Great Recession, how it had shown that in some ways, or showed very clearly that unfettered capitalism was neither efficient nor stable. Economic theory over the preceding 40 years had actually provided the intellectual foundations which explain why markets on their own were unlikely to be either efficient or stable. So in terms of modern economic theory, this is not a surprise. In the year immediately after the crisis, there was a lot of discussion about, in US and Europe, about redefining capitalism. I went to several conferences that in Paris and elsewhere in Europe, where there was a real struggle to say, how can we redefine capitalism? The sad thing was that in the end, very little was done. In the end, the forces of the financial sector, the forces that try to keep things minimally changed, change them a little bit, doctor up a few things, but not rethink capitalism, predominated. The result, I think, of this is going to be profound. I think it will result in the malaise, the weaknesses in the US and Europe continuing for years to come. It's likely to result in inequality remaining at the high levels that it has been and possibly even growing. It will affect not only our economies, but other aspects of our society, undermining our democracy, increasing the divides between the rich and the poor. Bihar has demonstrated that change is possible, that the possibilities of growth are enormous, that the state can be an important instrument for promoting growth. Its success has provided a ray of hope for all those struggling to develop. But one should not take such success for granted. Even in the midst of these successes, there are enormous challenges in sector after sector that you, I think, are well aware of. The lesson of this is that it will require continual work, and it will require keeping a vision in front of you of what is meant by success. Not growth for its own sake, but growth to improve the well-being of all citizens. What is needed is democratic, equitable, and sustainable growth. Thank you.
We just have time for a few questions. I'd like to invite questions now. Please note there should be questions and not a comment. A sharp, directed question. All right? A few questions. I want a show of hands and I'll get to you. Okay.
East Asian crisis, and then 2008 bubble burst in US. Thank you.
Mr. Stiglitz, you mentioned about AIG. What about its corporate ingratitude when it threatened to go?
Please speak only when I ask you to.
Achha.
All right, now, who was speaking?
Okay. You mentioned about AIG. What about its corporate ingratitude when it tried to threaten the same government which bailed out by giving $182 billion last week? It was some congressmen, especially of Democratic Party, which almost compelled them not to do so. What's your view on that?
Just two more questions. Oh, wait.
Sir, I have a simple question. This is Nalin Verma, Assistant Editor of Telegraph newspaper. Land is a big issue in our part of the world. Should the government allow the entrepreneurs or help the entrepreneurs in buying the land? This is the question.
Last question. Saurabh.
Hi. You told that the state should take some more affirmative actions in the development. But in a democratic setup, isn't it natural that the government takes decision only which is good for the political party? In that respect, are we talking about going out of the democratic setup? Or
I think, I'm sorry, that's all we have time for.
On the question, the first question had to deal with macroeconomics. And let me make just two comments. What was remarkable about the dominant macroeconomic paradigm in the advanced, around the world was that it not only didn't predict the crisis, the most important event, and the test of any science is prediction. And if you can't anticipate the most important event in 75 years, something's wrong with your model. But it was worse than that. Not only didn't it predict the crisis, it actually said these crises can't occur because markets are efficient and stable. So the models themselves were inconsistent with what has happened. One of the reasons that I've been very critical of this dominant paradigm is that they made assumptions which were totally unrealistic, including the assumption that information is very good. And my own work was emphasizing the work of asymmetric information. They excluded those problems. And so their analysis, which were absolutely essential to understanding this crisis. The second area where the models have failed is they failed to take account of how downturns spread from one country to another. So they actually argued that diversification was a good thing, and they believed that because of diversification, risk was essentially eliminated. So I don't know if many of you follow this, but in 2007 and early 2008, after the bubble broke in the United States, Bernanke was asked, "Are you worried?" And he said, "The problems are contained." And the reason he said that is his model said that. His model said that because they said that when you diversify, the risk is spread and nobody is affected very much. When I talk about these issues in Europe, I always begin by thanking the audience because the Europeans bought 40% of America's toxic mortgages. And if they hadn't bought so much of our toxic mortgages, the downturn in the US would have been much worse. But the notion of diversification, solving the problem, was actually, well before the crisis, had been analytically criticized. The IMF and others, when they talk about crises spreading from one country to another, use the word contagion. What is contagion? It's borrowed from epidemiology, the spread of diseases. If somebody has a disease, do you respond by saying diversifying? Let's take a group of people with the diseases and let's spread them and send them all over the world so the world will share in the disease. That's what diversification is. No, you don't. You do the opposite. You quarantine. So there was a kind of intellectual incoherence. Before the crisis, they talk about the benefits of diversification. After the crisis, they talk about the risks of contagion, of the dangers. It was intellectually incoherent. And that's been a real problem with macroeconomics more generally. And one of the things that I've been striving to do is to try to introduce a little bit element of intellectual coherence. On AIG, let me be very clear. AIG used its political influence with both parties under both the Bush and Obama administrations to get huge subsidies from the government. It should not have been allowed to do what it did in the first place. So I don't think anybody in either side, this is not a political issue. What is clear is, the real lesson is the influence of Wall Street, the financial markets, on American politics. You know, the financial markets spent huge amounts of money in the hundreds of millions of dollars trying to influence the political process. When they gave so much money, they were not donations, it wasn't charity, they were investments. And in fact, they got higher returns from their investments in Washington than they got from their investments in monetary assets, which they managed abysmally. Their real investments, they did terribly. Their financial investments, they did terribly. But their Washington investments, they got a huge return on. And we should recognize the dangers of money in politics. And that, I think, is the real lesson. I didn't quite understand the question on land, but let me just make a couple of observations. When you look at East Asia and the successful countries in East Asia, several of them began with land reforms. Land reform, I think, can be an absolutely essential ingredient in successful development, if it's managed well. It's not easy to manage land reform well, so I don't want to, but there have been successful cases of land reform that create a more vibrant economy, a more just, equal society, lead to a support in aggregate demand, but it has to be accompanied by transfers of technology, access to credit, access to markets. It can't be done what is needed is more than just changing claims, the ownership of land. It has to be a more comprehensive program. And one of the things that some of my early work was focused on the problems posed by sharecropping. And it's interesting, many people on the